Welcome to the New Jersey Seal of Biliteracy webinar with Thomas Sauer. As you can see on this slide, all participants will be automatically muted. So please use the question and answer chat to ask questions. You can make sure that your questions are private if you prefer. We'll be monitoring the question and answers, and we'll either pose those questions during the webinar or at the end. If you need any help, there's a support link there. And please note that the webinar today will be recorded. Today's webinar is part of a collaboration between the New Jersey Department of Education's State Seal of Biliteracy program, specifically in the divisions for academics and performance and student services, and Rutgers University. I'm Mary Curran, and I'm going to be hosting today's webinar. I'm the Director of Local Global Partnerships at Rutgers Graduate School of Education. And I'm very happy to introduce you to today's speaker, Thomas Sauer. Thomas is the co-director for PEARL, Professionals in Education Advancing Research and Language Learning, a Title VI Language Resource Center. And he's the Senior Associate for Professional Development at the National Foreign Language Center at the University of Maryland. Mr. Sauer is one of the 4 founders of the TEL framework, which we'll be hearing more about today. Mr. Sauer holds an MA in Germanic Languages and Literatures from the University of Kentucky, as well as an MA in Instructional Leadership and School Administration from Bellarmine University. He's previously worked as an independent consultant with school districts, post-secondary institutions, and other educational organizations after serving as a world language specialist for several school districts in the Midwest. He has taught German at the University of Kentucky, Georgetown College, the Kentucky Institute for International Studies, and Kentucky Educational Television. Mr. Sauer served on the board of directors of the American Council of the Teaching of Foreign Languages, as the president of the Kentucky World Language Association, as well as on the board of the National Association of District Supervisors of Foreign Languages and Central States Conference on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. Mr. Sauer has been described as a visionary thinker, designer, and change facilitator, and he's passionate about making the shift from teaching to learning. So please welcome Thomas Sauer for the webinar titled Facilitating Student Learning for the Seal of Biliteracy.
Thank you, Mary. Excuse me. Good morning, or whatever time you're watching this webinar. I'm excited to be here to kind of share what I like to always call the most enjoyable professional thrill ride of my life, which is the TEL project or the TEL framework, and hopefully help you understand how that can help you personally as a teacher, or if you're an administrator, help you guide your teachers in really making some shifts in their instructional practices. Not because we want them to change the way they teach, but we want their students to gain that seal of biliteracy. So before I get started, of course, I want to share some targets for our time together. And you can see those on the screen. We're going to identify the components of the TEL framework, explain how TEL criteria connect to what I like to call principles of proficiency. And then hopefully I'll be able to entice you in using some tools that might help you support the teaching of languages in your school or in your district. So I thought we would start with this big question, because that's what I have spent so much of my educational career trying to answer, and that is, what does effective language learning mean to you? And of course, everybody has a different answer, everybody has a different idea, and without wanting to go into the bigger picture or the bigger picture outcomes that we know happening when students are learning another language, I want to talk really about the part that we've been struggling with as a field, and that is, when we're talking about language learning, we're talking about measurable outcomes. That's the hard one, right? And when we're talking about measurable outcomes, that's really important now, obviously, in New Jersey with the seal of biliteracy. So we're talking about learning outcomes and disability, really referencing the idea of proficiency. Now, proficiency is a big word, and we like to throw it around a lot. And so what I'm going to explore for at least for this first part, what does this really mean for language learning? And it doesn't matter if the language learning context happens in a traditional second language classroom, if it happens in an English language learning classroom, or if it happens in an immersion classroom. The ideas are pretty much the same. So we're talking about proficiency, and we don't really have a good definition of it, or some people think we do. So I'd like to introduce you to these, what I call the principles of proficiency. And these are some principles that we use to guide our work as we develop the DEL framework. Because if you don't buy into those principles, everything else I'm going to talk about probably not going to matter to you. If your goal is not proficiency, if your goal is not a measurable language learning outcome, then anything I'm sharing about a TEL project is probably not going to be helpful, actually. So let's just kind of send that as a base for everything we're talking about. Principle number one is the idea that effective language learning is characterized by what learners can do with the language, not just what they know about the language. That's one that I think we're getting behind pretty well as a field. A proficiency continuum drives curriculum pacing, instructional repertoire, and assessment practices. So basically, everything a teacher does is driven by a proficiency continuum. What does that mean? Classroom-based language performances along the continuum leads to development of proficiency. And then the last one, performance and feedback are focused on moving students along the proficiency continuum. And then for you guys, of course, not just along the proficiency continuum, but towards that goal of reaching the seal of biliteracy. So I starred that word proficiency in every one of those principles, because I thought we really do need a definition, right? For what does proficiency really mean? So I just do what a good language teacher does. I went to the dictionary and found the definition. So here we have what Merriam-Webster says: a high degree of competence or skill, expertise. Okay, so that works, although I'm struggling with that word high, of course, because when we're starting in the beginning of the continuum, obviously, you might not have a high degree, we just have a competency. So here's another one. Functional language ability at various levels. Now that one I can get excited about, because now we're talking about what learners can do functionally with language, what are their abilities, and now we have this idea of various levels. So it's not about what they know, but how can they function within the language. So just kind of keep that idea of proficiency in your mind as we talk about everything today. So we have this understanding of proficiency, we have these principles, and then we have to lay on top of this the idea of teacher effectiveness. So what does teacher effectiveness actually mean? It's another one. We love buzzwords in education. Here's another one that we have now, teacher effectiveness. What I hope to be able to do today, but to share with some ideas about what we mean by effective teachers, and by teachers who are affecting proficiency, and by teachers who are affecting proficiency that lead to the seal of biliteracy. And to get us started, I thought I would share a little video of a class. And what I would like you guys to do is, as you watch this, think about how effective is this video. Rate it on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the most effective language learning class that you have ever seen, and 1 being the least effective language learning class you've ever seen. A little background, it's a middle school class, and it's a first-year Spanish class. You'll be able to see a couple of subtitles, but I don't even think you need them. If you understand what's going on in the class, I think you'll be able to make a decision. So again, decide on scale 1 to 5, 5 being the most effective, 1 being the least effective, and then we will discuss it afterwards. Okay, so I understand there is no sound. And it was running a little slow on my end as well. So we will just skip that video. And I will tell you, it's a video I've shown to teachers all around the country. And usually when they rate them, they're rated anywhere from a scale of 1 to 5, which is really the point of the video, that as a field of language educators, we can't agree what effective language teaching looks like, which of course is problematic. Because if we don't know what language teaching looks like, effective language teaching looks like, then how can we ever help support teachers to become more effective teachers, which is really the purpose of today's webinar in the present. So we're going to skip this first question because we can't answer it because you didn't see this video. And I apologize. I'm not sure what's going on today. And talk about how can we define effectiveness for language learning. And in order to do that, we're going to talk about the Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning project, or the Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning framework more specifically, and then some of the tools that support that framework. We're going to talk about what the framework looks like, and then what are some of the tools that are supporting you as educators. Now, I had a video here, but I'm not going to play it, just knowing that we had the issue with the video a second ago. But we can share the link to the video. It's just kind of an introduction of what the framework is. But I can do that myself. And so we're going to skip that video. But before we actually go into the framework, we've tried to talk about 3 core beliefs that undergird everything we do in the TEL framework. And that is the idea that the framework identifies teacher characteristics and behaviors representing the model world language teacher. I always call this Disneyland of teaching. This is never going to happen. This is the perfect kind of world, right? Perfect parents, perfect administrators, perfect kids. Money is no object. This is the ideal world. That's what the framework identifies. The second core belief is that world language teachers can become models if the model teacher is defined. So what do we mean by that? Well, if you're like me, you may enjoy watching HGTV or the Food Network. But it turns out that my food doesn't quite look like it does on the Food Network, and my home doesn't quite look like a home on HGTV. However, I still enjoy watching it because if I know what quote unquote perfect or the model looks like, I can work towards becoming that model. And then the final core belief is that the identified characteristics and behaviors are intended to guide individual teacher growth towards the model. So this is not an evaluation system, and I hope that nobody takes the tools that are developed through TEL as an for evaluative purposes, but they are truly guided to help each individual teacher grow and work towards becoming that effective model teacher. So since we didn't see the video, let me just explain then. There is a central to the entire project is a framework, and the framework is developed around 7 domains. Each domain is guided by an essential question that teachers might ask themselves, say, how can I be more effective with my students? And all of these domains then have criteria that describe those behaviors and are the answer to the essential question in a way. They're also all developed with the notion that it's not what the teacher knows, but what the teacher does in the classroom that has the biggest impact on student achievement. So it's one thing to know all these things, but it's what the teacher does. And what TEL does is kind of provide guidance to teachers to measure what they're doing in the classroom. So when we then go into the framework, there are these 7 domains. The first one is the environment domain. And you can see here, there's the example of one of those essential questions. How do teachers create a safe and supportive learning environment to prepare for student learning? And then underneath that essential question, you would have a set of criteria that answer that question, identify what is it that effective teachers actually do. The second domain is planning. How do teachers plan learning experience? You will not be surprised to find out that planning is the largest domain in the entire framework. Not because teachers have so much time for planning, but because we know without planning, nothing happens in a classroom. Learning experience is another domain. So how do you facilitate, how do you provide those meaningful learning experiences to advance student learning? And we have the domain called performance and feedback. And this is all about, and we used to call it assessment, but assessment has now become, it used to be a test was the dirty word, now assessment is the dirty word because nothing is really changing. So if you really think about what is the role of assessment in language learning, it is performance and feedback. What can students do? And how can you as the teacher, how can the learner themselves or their peers provide feedback to help them improve on their performance? And remember, that connects again to one of our principles of proficiency. Learning tools, collaboration, working with other stakeholders, and then the final domain is professionalism. And of course, just being part of this webinar, you're already exemplifying the criteria that I identified in this particular domain. So then when you stack them all together, you get a framework of 7 domains, each domain outlining what effective teacher does. And that results into about 40 main indicators and multiple, I won't even tell you the number, sub-criteria. So you might think 40 things, Thomas, I'm just trying to figure out how to make it through the day. And that's the important thing to remember about the TEL framework. This is the model teacher, remember? So it's not that you're supposed to do all these 40 things. We don't expect any teacher to ever do all these 40 things. It's just, these are the 40 many things that a teacher might do to help them become more effective as a language teacher. Now, where you start that journey is going to be different for every single teacher. And that was kind of the thought process behind our logo as well. As you can see, there's the different colors representing the different domains. You see different blocks indicating the different indicators, but they're all broken. There's not a straight line. In fact, the entire circle is even broken up. There is no continuum to teacher effectiveness. It's not think if you do this, you'll do that next, and then you can do that. It's more the idea of where you are. Every teacher can enter the framework wherever they are because we all have different experiences. And I think one of the beautiful things about TEL framework is that it acknowledges that every teacher has experiences, every teacher has a background that they bring to the table and trying to get more effective as a teacher. So then I have a reflective question just here for us to pause for a second. We've only talked about the domains. I've only given you the essential questions, but we haven't actually looked at the criteria yet. And so my question is, what criteria of effective language teaching would you expect to find in each domain? So if you had to think about, you wrote maybe a domain or you fill out one of these frameworks, what would you identify as top 5 criteria of effective language teaching? What are the effective criteria for planning? What are the effective criteria for assessment? Okay, and then I will continue. That question doesn't go away from you, obviously. Let's talk a little bit about planning. I already mentioned it is the largest domain in the framework. So of course, there are the most indicators that you can see there. And I wanted to highlight a few that I think are most important for teachers. In fact, I just got asked that question last week in the event. And they said, oh, it's so big, but Thomas, which ones are the most important ones if you had to narrow it down? So this is not an official statement. These are just Thomas's picks. As I have worked with teachers around the country and think this is what they're struggling with, or these are the ones that I think will have the biggest impact on changing the way you plan for language learning. To get us started, I want us just to look at this paragraph. I'm not going to read it to you because you can do that yourself. But as you read it, I want you just to think about what are some keywords that jump out at you in this paragraph when you think about what does effective teaching, in this case, effective planning, look like. So here are some of the words that stuck out for me. That is the idea that we have a context that is relevant, that we're using backward design, performance tasks, and the idea of learning targets to prepare students for these backward design performance tasks of relevant context that provide everything for language learning. So let's look at some specific criteria from the framework, because without showing you the entire framework, you can do that on your own. I want to highlight a few that I think are most important. P4A states that the teacher sets daily learning targets that unpack the performance objectives of the unit. Wow, that's a mouthful, isn't it? The second one is P6B that states the teacher selects strategies to ensure language input is comprehensible. And the third one is P7A, the teacher plans opportunities for students to produce language after ensuring sufficient input. So those are three that I always think hit nerves with teachers. We know we're supposed to do them, but how to actually do it is a different story. So, and I want to talk just to give you some practical advice and talk about that first one, the idea of that we have daily learning targets that unpack performance objectives of the unit. There's a lot happening in that one statement, and what does that really look like in real life? So I have here just a template that some districts have used, the idea of how they unpacking objectives. And in this particular template, they have performance objectives. Don't get hung up in terminology. Every district, every school calls it something different. But what's the real purpose here? And you can see that we're talking about a big performance objective. So a big picture outcome that it's informed by the proficiency target in the context of the unit. And then in this particular template, we're asking teachers to unpack that into smaller indicators and then actual learning targets and be really intentional about their sequencing of the learning targets. But what do we really mean by learning targets? Because I've seen teachers actually use this template and fill it out. And then I looked and I said, this is not what we had in mind. So let's talk about what we really mean by the idea of a learning target, and then what does that mean for unpacking. So we're talking about a learning target. We're talking about something that is so specific that students can do at the end of the class that they couldn't do before they walked in the room. Let me read that again. A learning target describes what students can do at the end of the class that they couldn't do before they walked in the room. That's pretty specific, right? And we will look at the structure of that. Every one of our learning targets is then, of course, connected to a check for learning. And if you use one of these kind of templates, you do this planning before you ever decide anything else. So you have your target, you have your check for learning, which is really just your formative assessment, your last activity of the day. And then you decide, oh, if this is my target and this is my check, what are the language chunks that I need for my students to be successful? What is the vocabulary they need to know? What is the content, and where are the culture connections that will help my students be prepared for the check for learning? So then how do you write these learning targets? We know when to write them. We know how to connect them to perhaps a check for learning, a formative assessment. And so I'm going to give you a really simple formula for how to write a learning target. It's really just three things. It sounds really simple. Yeah, the idea of I can, right? We know that. I can statements or can do statements are used throughout education, not just in language learning. We add a language function. We add a context. And that makes a good learning target. Sounds really simple, right? Now, here's my question. Could you give me a definition of what a language function might mean? That is the hard part. Context, I think most teachers understand. Language functions is hard part. So I'm going to show you a list of language functions. Don't go crazy when you see this slide. It's a lot of little text, a lot of little verbs. That's not the important part. But the idea here is that we can categorize language functions, or we can categorize what students do with language into these different domains. When students use language, they're either socializing, they're exchanging information, they're getting things done, they're expressing attitudes, or they're maintaining and organizing communication. So for each one of these categories, there are a bunch of language functions. This is not a complete list, but just some examples of what some of these language functions are. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about a language function in a learning target. This is what language learning is really about. Unfortunately, in the past, language learning has been so much about knowing vocabulary or understanding words or producing content. But really, if we think about language learning, is about doing these things functionally with the language. I often try to explain this as the beginning of the sentence is more important than the end of the sentence. Now, I'm obviously generalizing here, but let me explain. The beginning of a sentence, the part of the learning target has the I can plus language function. That's the important part. We need students to be able to do that function more how they complete the sentence. So for example, so often we want students to know all the words for how they can describe what they want to be when they grow up. So they learn not a million, but they learn dozens of professions. So they can say, I want to be an astronaut, and I want to be a teacher, and I want to be a fireman, and I want to be a lawyer, and I want to be whatever. It's not important that they know how to complete the sentence, right? It's the function beginning that's so important. I want to be. That's the important part, because if they know how to say that, they can say anything. What they want to be, it's going to change in 5 minutes anyways, if they're elementary kids. So we got to think about this. How can we focus our language learning more on the beginning of the sentences, where the verb or the action, where the language function happens, rather than trying to complete the sentence with all the information in the world that they have now available at their fingertips. And then, of course, once we write that learning target, again, we want to make sure that that is connected to a check for learning, that formative assessment piece. Okay, I'm going to pause here for just a second and give you this reflection question. And I think that's a good one for every teacher and anybody supporting teaching to ask themselves or to ask their teacher. And that is, what would happen to your lesson plans if you thought of yourself less as an activity designer and more of an assessor? Okay, as you ponder that, I'm going to transition now into our next section, which is the idea of teaching. So we talked about planning, and now we're going to talk a little bit about teaching. What are some of the TEL criteria that are key to really an effective language teacher? And some of the ones that I've identified come, of course, from the learning experience domain. And you can see it on your screen. The first one is LE3D, that the teacher uses a variety of verbal and nonverbal strategies to make language comprehensible. Again, that's true for any language teacher. The teacher selects strategies to ensure language input is comprehensible. That's from the planning one. I did not finish this slide. You're seeing an old version of the slide. So let's just focus on that first one. I apologize. This idea of comprehensible input is the one that most teachers still don't understand, and we're still struggling with. And so if you go back to the previous slide just a second ago and thought about the idea of the learning target, what is my goal and how I'm going to check for learning at the end? What is the input that students need for that? I let me take you back to, just a German class that I taught. You heard I taught pretty much every level except for middle school. So God bless you for doing middle school. It's the level I could never do. But this may or may not have been my classroom. I started in a unit. I had prepared a fantastic PowerPoint with authentic images to introduce all the new vocabulary, and I went through it. And the students even took really good notes because we had a good note-taking PD in our school the previous year. And then I had designed this really engaging activities where students could use the new vocabulary to talk to each other about it. And then I let them go. And as I was monitoring the class, because of course I'm supposed to monitor the class, right? I noticed the front table, they're doing fine, they're doing great. They're doing exactly what I had envisioned them to do. As I'm walking further back to back class, the middle tables, they're kind of a little confused. I help them out. And by the time I get to the back of the class, I realized they're not doing anything that I asked them to do. They're just talking about what they're going to do this weekend. So I run back to the front and I try to explain these words again, now in a different way. And so now I'm up there and pantomiming the words and trying to get them to understand what these words mean, and I let them go again. Of course, the front table jumps right into it because they had it already the first time, so they can do it again. Second table is still confused, and the back table is just like, I don't understand what he's saying, speak English. So now I'm running up front, I'm trying to figure out what else can I do, and I'm find some old overhead transparencies that I can show them, or some old video I had saved somewhere, and I'm trying to model the strategy, and I'm explaining these words again, and I want him to go, and maybe I'm cutting down the activity by half, and then the bell rings and the class is over. Have anybody had an experience like this? What's the problem here? Students didn't have enough input. So this word here, variety of input, this idea of variety of verbal and non-verbal strategies to make language comprehensible, didn't happen in my classroom. I didn't check for understanding along the way. I didn't provide them multiple opportunities to really gain ownership of these words. So if I had given them that PowerPoint presentation and then introduced and then had them do some kind of processing where they just non-verbally demonstrated to me that they understood the words, and we had done 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of those activities where I checked, did they understand? And every time I checked, the students got the feedback, oh, every time he says this, it means this. I think I know what that word means. If I had given them those opportunity and then asked them to do that really engaging activity end, that whole learning experience would have gone very, very differently. So knowing that, we might just change the way we think about that kind of teaching. All right, I'm going to skip one part. And that is kind of switched now towards the tool parts. So we just kind of looked at some of the framework. Again, there's 40 criteria, and we looked at 4 of them. There are 40 main ones and literally over 150 sub-criteria that you could explore, but we don't have time to do that on a webinar. And I would never, ever recommend you do that either. Because remember, the goal is not to make you feel like a bad teacher, but to help you guide you in your individual growth. So let's talk about some of these TEL tools. The first one that I think is incredibly important is that we have taken the entire framework and correlated to other framework that already exists in both general education and world language education. So on our website, you can find a correlation to Danielson's framework, Marzano's framework for effective teaching, to the National Board Teaching Standards, to the INTAS standards, to the CAPE standards that are being used for teacher education programs. Why did we do this? Because we know that teachers come, tell us the new thing, and they don't come from that. They come from a different background. So for example, I know a lot of districts in New Jersey are familiar with the Danielson framework. So this is what teachers are familiar with. This is what principals and other administrators are familiar with. But do they really know what, for example, this particular statement looks like in a Chinese kindergarten immersion classroom? Here we have the statement: students are intellectually engaged throughout the lesson with appropriate activities and materials, instructive representation of content, and suitable structure and pacing of the lesson. This is something that was designed to apply to all teachers, but not language teachers. We can then look at TEL and TEL will explicate what this means in terms that language teachers can actually understand. So here are 2 of the indicators that I found in the framework that make a little bit more sense. The idea that we're planning opportunities for students to process written and spoken text, again, comprehensible input. And the idea that teachers plan opportunities for students to produce language after they have received sufficient input. That's something that language educators can understand, and that makes a whole lot more sense. So you'll be able to see how every one of those 40 indicators correlates directly to Daniels. And so if that's being used in your district, you now have a better understanding what they might mean when they talk about something in their big fancy buzzword language in the PD. But then the most important thing, and I think the most helpful tool for educators, are what we call, well, let me step back. There's two more tools. There's self-assessments. So we've taken the entire framework and turned them into self-assessments so you can see how well you're doing. The idea here is that it allows you to reflect on your current practices. When you do that, when you take one of these self-assessments, and they are available for the entire framework, they're available by domain. I would never recommend any teacher do the entire framework, but pick a domain and kind of focus on that. Use evidence to support reflection. This is not a cosmopolitan quiz. This is not where this is not where you're supposed to check all the things that you're supposed to do but not doing yet. But really think about, if Thomas comes into your classroom, where would he see evidence of whatever you checked? So what's the evidence to support your reflection? Then most importantly, share your findings with some kind of friend. Let them know how you did so that you have an accountability partner. And then set meaningful goals for growth. As teachers, we like to set a bunch of goals. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. We recommend that teachers down set more than 2 goals for any given time period. So maybe that's 2 goals for now until spring break, or it's 2 goals for now until the end of the school year. Or maybe it's just 2 goals for the entire year of 2019. But don't go and try to identify all these things. Yes, we would love for you to work on lots of these things, but let's focus on 2 goals. Now, this is the part that teachers, I think, find most helpful, and that is our idea of feedback tools. Once you have set your goals, obviously you need to get feedback on how well you're doing. It has to be feedback on things that you have identified as a goal, not what somebody else has identified for you as a goal. So what I see lots of happening is that principals or other administrators are coming through buildings and look for certain evidence of certain things that they would like to see. But if that is not your professional growth goal right now, you're probably not going to get better at it, right? And if you have another professional growth goal to maybe informed by a self-assessment and self-framework, you need feedback on how well you're doing on that particular goal. So what we're trying to do with these forms is provide you with a mirror to your own practice. We all run around with these crazy devices. Just put up the phone in the back, record your class, and then maybe use one of these feedback tools and self-assess again. How well are you doing towards meeting that goal? These feedback tools are full of strategies. I'll show you in a second. But they're again designed to encourage that reflective practice. They allow you to collect data on teacher practices. I was in a classroom in Florida last fall. Teacher didn't know I was coming in, and she had a stack that was probably 2.5 inches tall of these feedback forms. She had assigned 1 student in her class every single day to be the role of the evaluator. Didn't like the term, but that's what she used. And she used that same form, and every day, one of her students was charged with checking off how well she was doing in those particular strategies. Now, the nice thing about that was, of course, not only did she have now actually data that she can take to her principal and say, look, at the beginning of the year, I was doing it hardly ever, and now I'm doing it all the time. But also now her students kind of understood why she was doing what she was doing, and it really allowed for some really interesting conversations. And again, of course, these are aligned to your growth plans. What does this look like? I'm going to blow one of these apps to kind of show you. These are not criterion based, they're more strategy based. So you can see exactly step-by-step things that you're supposed to do. So this one is one where you're supposed to give, how do you give directions in the target language? Or this next one is about how do you provide comprehensive, but how, what's the language that you use as a teacher? And some of these, you can see some of these have just observable behaviors. Some of them you can check off the individual strategies that you have actually done. One of my personal favorites is the one about student target language use. And again, just do it yourself, record the class, and then just tally. Notice there's a little chart that says each time a student is observed producing language, place a tally mark in the appropriate column, just to kind of find out how much language are my students producing and at what level. you might be surprised. Maybe your students are only producing word level language. Why is that? Is that because the question you ask? Is that because of the context you provided for them? There's lots of answers to that question, but without having that kind of data, it's really hard to even figure out why it's happening, what is happening in your class. All these feedback tools are, again, designed to empower you. We've identified what we think are hot button issues for most teachers. So you'll find one for checking for understanding. You'll find one for parent small group work. How do I do that? How do you facilitate classroom interactions? How do you get them to talk to each other using the language? There's one for developing even learning targets, for the planning one. How do you use the target language? How do you engage learners? How do you conduct performance assessments? What kind of learning tools do you use? What does your environment look like of your classroom? How do you give directions and model? There's that student language use one, and then there's even one that you could share with an administrator that's a full class observation that takes you from the beginning of class all the way to the end. All of these tools is what teachers really seem to like. They're available for free, doesn't cost anything. You can just download them as PDFs in both color, black and white. Some of the PDFs are even fillable, so you can save them and keep them as a record on your device. So after I just bombarded you with self-assessments, correlations, a series of feedback tools, I have this question. How might you use the feedback tools to facilitate conversations about teacher effectiveness? And as you think about the answer to that question, I want to share with you a couple other tools that are TEL related. And they're all designed to help you, again, your teachers grow as practitioners so they can better prepare students to meet the seal of biliteracy. The first one is, and why I wasn't able to show you as much from the framework, is the entire framework has been revised. In fact, you guys have seen, the first audience has ever seen any of the new indicators. But it's being launched this spring. So the entire framework has been revised for the first time in 5 years. And if you go to the website right now, you'll still see the old version, but the new one is coming incredibly soon, maybe even by the time you watch this webinar. The next tool that might be of interest to you is we're beginning to create an online portfolio or an online community for teachers that's going to launch in a beta version this summer. And this portfolio will allow teachers to identify evidence based on the TEL criteria, upload the evidence into an online platform, and then get that evidence verified by other teachers and experts from around the country. It's going to be also in a community part where you can reflect, share reflections, and even give support to other teachers around either in your district, in your state, or even around the country if you connect with them. That's coming again as a beta version this summer. And then the final tool really applies for anybody that's a department chair, a district supervisor, or has some other teacher leader position. This summer, we will be hosting our first Summer Institute in collaboration with the National Association of District Supervisors Foreign Languages. And it's all focused on how can I use TEL and make it work in my classroom or in my district. We'll be meeting for about 2.5 days from July 11th through July 13th in College Park, Maryland, and really digging in deeper into the framework and how can you develop processes that might work. And there's a tool, they're all available free download, but obviously without a plan, without trying to figure out what can I do with them, they're just tools like any other tool, and we want you to actually use them. Oops. So that gets us kind of to the end. I apologize. There were some technical glitches. I'm not sure why my computer is glitching. Of course, it didn't glitch in the preview, but it is glitching now, and I wasn't able to show you the 2 videos. But I will be able to share the links to those videos because they're all available on YouTube. But I hope I was able to help you identify the main components of the framework, explain a little bit how those criteria connect to the principles of proficiency, and also maybe spark some seeds for developing a plan of how you can use the TEL tools to support teaching of language learning. in your district.
Thank you very much, Thomas. While we're waiting to see if anybody wants to send in some questions for Thomas or for some comments, I want to make a few announcements. It'll give you a minute to come up with questions. The first one is just a reminder from the New Jersey Department of Education about the Seal of Biliteracy. Check your email and make sure that you've received the spreadsheet that is used for sending in information with the sealed data. And the final date to upload that is March 15th for 2019. So that's a quick announcement. And then our next webinar is March 12th at 11 a.m. with Elizabeth Franks, and we'll be focusing on increasing ELL's participation in the Seal of Biliteracy, challenges and solutions. So those were two quick announcements. Thomas, thank you. It was really interesting to have that walk through the TEL framework and see all the tools that are available. One thing I wanted to bring up and just have you speak about a little bit, this tool is for language teachers, both world language and ESL teachers as well, correct?
Correct, yes. Yeah, that's why, and we talked about that a lot even when we came up with the name, right? So it's teacher effectiveness for language learning. One of the things to always remember is that, and the struggle I have as a parent right now, to be honest, trying to convince my children's teachers to realize that they are language teachers as well. In my mind, any teacher is a language teacher. And in fact, a lot of the strategies that you see in there are good teaching strategies for any teachers. We've had people look at them from music, from art, and like, oh yeah, this is what we do too. But yeah, this really is designed for anybody who teaches languages, because the problems that we're having in education are often language-based, right? We don't have, in my mind, an achievement gap, we have a language gap. And so the strategies and the solutions that we have as language educators, because of our understanding of proficiency, actually are the solutions to any subject area and anybody teaching any content area.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up. I know at the Graduate School of Education, we're trying to make sure that every teacher candidate takes a class called Teaching Emerging Bilinguals with exactly that intent. And if they're teaching biology or math or science, they need to be aware that the vehicle for their instruction is language. So that's a really important point.
Yeah, because every kid is a language learner, right? I mean,
exactly.
Sure, my daughter is a bilingual because I'm raising her German, but if I weren't raising her in German and English, she would still be an English language learner.
Exactly, that's right. And it gets back to that point about the continua of proficiency that you talked about in the beginning. We're all on that continua at some point for the languages that we use and for the languages that are new to us. Correct. We have a question for you about other opportunities for learning about the TEL project besides the July event that you mentioned.
Other opportunities. That's a really good question. I don't know how to answer that. That's the main one right now. I'm sure there'll be others in the future.
Mm-hmm. I think that knowing your website, because I'm familiar with it, and knowing that all the information is free, just going in and, you know, accessing things is helpful. And the video you were going to show is available on that website as well, too, isn't it?
I believe so. If not, it's also on, if you just go to YouTube and type in TEL project, it's the first one. I'll share the link to make sure that you can share that with all the participants.
Okay, good. And Thomas, if you have upcoming, you know, workshops or seminars or things, let us know. We can send that out to the people on our mailing list. I know you mentioned a little bit about this, but what are some of the most powerful ways you've seen like world language or ESL supervisors in school districts using the TEL framework?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one of the, well, here's a couple. It often works better when the teachers are doing it themselves than when a supervisor directs them to do it, right? So I'll put that in front, but here are some of the way we've seen it. In one school, it was through the help of the supervisor, and then the department chair kind of took on the leadership for that and ran it. But the entire department took the self-assessment. They all identified their goals. Then the department chair summarized it to figure out what are the goals that we have in common. And then they came up with not just individual goals, but they came up with department goals. And those then became the the focus point for the discussion. They were lucky that they had their shared common lunch period, and then all their professional development that they did themselves was focused on trying to get better at that goal. They also figured out a system for observing each other. So they used these feedback tools that I shared with you. And there's, come in my class during a planning period. And we're not asking for you to stay for the entire, however long your period is, but if you just come in for 10 minutes, use that form so I can have some feedback. Because yes, it's great to videotape yourself and see it, but it's even better when somebody else does it to you. And so in that school, they were really able to do that because they developed a system that once a week, they had a commitment that I have to go to another teacher during my planning period for 10 minutes to see them, provide them feedback. In return, they will do the same for me. And so that really created this culture of, we're talking about our teaching. We're not just shutting our door. We're talking about how we're teaching, and we're trying to get better at this as a group. And that worked amazingly in that school. In fact, they ended up using that model for all the other content areas as well.
Yeah, that really sounds good. And I know a lot of schools do have, time for learning communities or communities of practice to meet during the week. So it would be a perfect tool to use. Someone's asked if you could go back to the page with the TEL framework website too. That would be helpful to see again. Please send questions if you have any right now. As we're waiting, I just wanted to say, Thomas, I love that idea of using it for having students assess the teacher and, just quickly asking a few questions of the students and getting that feedback and showing the growth. That's really nice. And I also go ahead.
No, it was really impressive. And then I talked to some of the students who probably knew more about language teaching because they had that role. Than any other student group that I had. And I thought that was really powerful, to take kind of that secrecy out of language learning, to let them know, this is why I'm doing this to you. There's a reason,
Right. Be good for the parents to have access to that information as well. And then I'm thinking that sets the students up with high expectations for future teachers too. We, in schools of teacher education now, are charged with demonstrating the evidence that our teacher candidates can be successful too. So I'm really looking forward to that portfolio project you talked about as well. It could be really helpful for us as a tool. So thank you for sharing that. That's new for me. I didn't know about that.
It is really new, and it's growing really fast. We think it's going to have a huge impact. Because it's going to connect the more isolated teachers as well. Not every state is as densely populated as New Jersey is.
That's true. That's true. And maybe just to close, I love the comments you put in there about what would it mean if teachers began thinking of themselves as assessors. And I don't know if you want to say anything about it, but it struck me in a powerful way if every day as the teacher you're looking for evidence of learning. And as you said, students should come into a classroom. When they leave, there should be something new they can do with language.
Yeah, I asked that question because I, coming from the TEL background, I truly believe that there are no bad teachers, and no teacher wants to do poorly. Everybody does to the best of their ability almost every day. It's more of a matter of figuring out what not to do than what to do differently. And that might be the hardest part for teachers. So what I mean by that is when I go into classrooms, most of the time I see students who are engaged. I see students who are doing things, who are enjoying it. They love coming to whatever language class it is or whatever language learning scenario it is. But what I don't often see is being on purpose and connected, and the teacher knows why they're doing what they're doing, and the students know this. And so to have a learning target that's connected for a very specific check for learning that kind of drives everything I do, it's going to cause teachers to make different decisions about what activities they're doing. It doesn't mean that the activities they have been doing are bad. It just might mean that that activity is the wrong activity at the wrong time, right? It might be a better activity served later down the road. And so often we do activities because we like the activity, and the kids seem to they appear to be engaged or seem to have fun even. And so we keep doing these activities, but they're not actually related to the learning target. If they're not related to a learning target, they're not going to help prepare the students meet a check for learning, which means they're not going to prepare the students to perform well on the performance assessments at the end of the unit, which means you're not going to be able to give them feedback to help them grow on that proficiency continuum. So when you think like an assessor, you think about like that proficiency target first, and then kind of work backwards towards your learning target all the way down to the activity. And that just changes then what activities you choose when. And again, it's really important to know it's not about that they are bad activities. And you can find activities, that's the other thing, you can find activities online everywhere, right? You can Google them, you can pay for them. Activities are not, not the hard part, but deciding when to teach what so that students can actually grow in the proficiency continuum, that is the hardest part of teaching. And that is what the TEL project is really all about.
Yeah, I think you said that really nicely, and we have a lot of tools out there, like you mentioned the Danielson framework, which is a general tool talking about quality instruction, but to have access to the TEL tools is really something special for language teachers who can see what it looks like in the language classroom. And then in the context of this webinar series, thinking about the seal of biliteracy, if that really is our end goal, that we're imagining the students being able to receive that seal, we need to give them opportunities to demonstrate success in the language along the way and push towards that high proficiency in the classroom.
Yeah, you said it well. You said if, right? And that's the big thing.
Right.
If we're saying that the goal, the seal is the goal, and I think it's a great goal to have, then we must believe in proficiency, which means we must make certain changes as teachers. And that's what TEL helps teachers to do, to make those changes to help kids reach that goal of proficiency and help that reach goal of high levels of proficiency that could lead to the seal. And to me, that's incredibly exciting. And I think New Jersey teachers should be excited and proud of what's happening.
Well, that's true. I agree. Thank you, Thomas, so much for your time today. I know it was very insightful, informative for me, and I'm sure that the other participants agreed. We have recorded this, and we'll be sharing a link to the webinar for those who couldn't attend today. And just a reminder, the next webinar is March 12th at 11 a.m. with Elizabeth B.J. Franks, focusing on increasing ELL's participation in the seal of biliteracy, challenges and solutions. Thank you again, Thomas.
Thank you.